Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Duncan Philpott left the streams of Sheffield and now casts a fly to sea trout and trout in Sweden. We talk about the difference between the two, and he tells us about a huge trout he stalked on one of his local rivers. He also covers his work that revolves around trout as well. Duncan has shot images for two US magazines I admire greatly, The Drake and Fly Fish Journal, and has shot a front cover for Fly Culture as well as other photographs, and has written for us about his lockdown rod build. This is a fascinating podcast that I hope you're going to enjoy. Hey Duncan, it's great to have you along on the Fly Culture Podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Pete. It's a bit strange to be doing one of these, listened to quite a few, but thanks for having me on.
You're most welcome. And how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm sat inside on quite a cloudy day. We've had like masses of sun for ages here, pretty much drought conditions, like it seems most of the places in the world at the moment. But finally it's broken, and daily thunderstorms add to the excitement.
And for listeners, could you tell us where you are? Because you said here, and I obviously know where you are, but could you tell listeners where you're based now?
Sure, yeah. So I am in Stockholm, Sweden. I've been here for about a year and a half now. It was a bit of an unexpected move of sorts. Kind of the lockdowns in the UK were catalysts for many things, but here, well, we got a bit restless, early midlife crisis, total change of career path, and my girlfriend found a new job here in Sweden. And I moved with her, and that led to me it coincided with me deciding to change career. And it's been quite the life change in many capacities.
And you're a year and a bit into it. Are you nicely settled, both of you?
Yeah, we are. Certainly the settling process took a while. Things have been a little more tricky post-Brexit. A lot more systems to go through, a lot of newfound respect for anyone that migrates to a different country. It's not a straightforward process, and you always feel like you're doing the wrong thing. And there's always more questions and more information you have to submit. But we made it. I'm in for 5 years now at least, so we'll see how that pans out.
Excellent. And obviously listeners and myself, of course, are fascinated to hear about the fishing opportunities there. And what is it that you're getting up to there?
So, I think I should start with Sweden is a much bigger place than I think a lot of people give it credit for. Where we are here in Stockholm is probably similar sort of latitude to Inverness, or actually a bit further north in Scotland, but it's the weather is not too dissimilar to the UK. I'd say the winters are definitely colder and the summers are probably warmer, but daylight much for a muchness. However, Stockholm is quite flat. It's incredibly flat. And because of these hotter summers, there's actually no trout river fishing for like probably a 3-hour drive out of the city centre. And I think this has been the biggest shift for me. I used to live in Sheffield. I had multiple rivers. I had one in walking distance of my doorstep, and that could be like a daily visit. And many more rivers, like the Peak District has some fantastic fishing in it, as well as the urban stuff in Sheffield. And I was sport for choice. Now it's weird. I don't really fish, and I've become one of these people that does a very intense sort of 2-week-long trip every now and then, at least in the summer. Because I'll move on to the winter fishing in a second. But because of this lack of trout nearby, I mean, you can fish for perch and you can fish for pike in the sort of local lakes and things like that. And where I used to live, there was a lovely crystal clear lake next to that, and sight fishing for fish in there was great. And I probably would still get out, I don't know, once a week, once every couple of weeks. But we've since moved. I've moved closer to work while I'm still very close to water. And to be honest, in Sweden, you're never far away from water. It's so busy with people. Everybody's swimming, everybody's enjoying it. There's always boats. There's like so many other anglers on the water. Lake Mälaren, which is one of the big lakes here in Sweden. It's 100+ kilometers long, and it is sort of free to the public. So everybody's on it, and I just haven't quite found the same inspiration to try and fly fish it. Access is quite limited. You probably want a boat. It's a lot of these lakes I said Stockholm's flat, but it actually undulates a lot between 40 meters and sea level with these sort of really sharp, rocky outcrops. And that leaves you very limited areas to fish from the shore. And where it is shore fishing, it's usually a beach and it's usually swimming because everybody swims. It's a great quality of life. I enjoy the swimming myself, so I can't complain. And then in the winter, we get to fish for sea trout in the archipelago. They sort of come in a bit closer with those colder temperatures. I know you're familiar with the sort of Scandinavian coastal fishing style, but Stockholm is a tough fishery. There aren't many fish numbers. A lot of the spawning streams for the trout have had so the only trout that do exist in this region are very short coastal small streams that are all protected from angling, which I think is very rightly so because it's a very threatened population in the archipelago. They sort of do release like hatchery fish, which they fin clip for the sake of recreational fishery. But I mean, I'm divided on that anyway. But yeah, winter fishing, it's something I will do regularly. It's one of those, if you have a contact, you get really happy. Like even if you have a missed tape or something, it's proper, really just investing your hours. And there are hot spots, but I don't really like going back to the same place over and over and over again. If it is known to be a hotspot, I kind of want to work out what are the sort of dynamics at play that make that a hotspot and where I can replicate that elsewhere in the archipelago, because it's so much water. It's all free. So much to go out, and it's crazy. Like from shallow bays to rocky outcrops and everything. It's really, really varied. And the winter fishing is probably the best fishing in Stockholm. And then summertime, as I said, huge country. We have all the way in the south, you get early season dry fly fishing or river fishing in counties like Skåne and near Gothenburg. And then these get too warm for trout fishing, usually this time of year, maybe a little bit earlier. So everyone moves to the mountains, and then we've just got, the whole of the Arctic Circle, Lapland sort of masses of mountain fishing. And typically the fishing's really divided up into quite all-inclusive county board tickets for the mountain fishing, so the harder to access stuff. And then the rivers and lakes that are easier to access are still in like very well publicized fiskevårdsområden, so like fishing care areas or like fishing society areas. And your typical day tickets like a £5, £4, something like that. A season's 30-40 quid, and this is for hundreds of kilometers of water. So it's an incredibly accessible sport. And because of that, I think I've heard statistics thrown around. I've not bothered to look them up, but there's a wonderful one. It's like, almost everybody in the growing up in Sweden, like within a family or like a relationship or like a unit, has tried fishing. So there's always somebody that, be it with like a lure rod in a lake, so close to water, it's so accessible. And it's a very broad demographic of anglers here.
So that sounds a really lovely mix potentially for you. But does it mean that a river that you could walk to very, very easily when you were based in Sheffield, comparable to having to go such a long distance to fish, does that hurt a little bit sometimes?
Yeah, I certainly miss it on a day-to-day business. Hugely. Because I was freelance with my work before, I could fish 3 or 4, 5 times a week when I wasn't working. I'd have intense working spells, but then I would certainly put a lot of fishing time on the water. And I haven't been fishing for that long of a time in the grand scheme of things. I came into angling quite late, and it was purely being able to put a lot of time on the water and have some really good brains to pick near me in Sheffield. People like Paul Gaskell, who was super helpful when I was starting out. Meant that I managed to progress quite quickly to where I was quite a confident, independent angler, and I enjoyed exploring new water, new places, and would have success doing so. And, never fell into this trap of repeating the same day of fishing again and again, which I think is all too easy to do in the UK, especially like with the sort of smaller stretches of water within clubs, just due to the way, smaller country, so many people. You don't get as much opportunity to constantly go to new places and test that side of fishing.
And how do you find the rivers comparable to the ones in Sheffield? Can you describe the sort of streams that you've just mentioned?
I mean, here, so in Sheffield, it was typically super urban, small freestone to like a small, medium-sized freestone, I'd say, with the Don. And then when it got a bit bigger, it turned to coarse species sort of as you were going out the other side of Sheffield. I mean, full of shopping trolleys, bricks, you name it, all sorts of interesting. I mean, but there's a lot of free fishing in Sheffield, and it's a wonderful place to learn if you're not, because the alternative and what I sort of got access to just as I was leaving Sheffield was, it's the Peak District where you have like rivers that many people listening to will be familiar with, like the Wye and the Derwent, and some quality fishing. And comparing this to Sweden, these are all very small rivers. Here in Sweden, you can find similar sized rivers to fish, but people don't really pay much attention to that. There's huge river systems with, sizable fish that span from the mountains all the way to the sea. And it was a bit like even going to Scotland and fishing some of the larger rivers up there is still much smaller. And it was a really new experience. I think I certainly, my first summer of river fishing here, still stuck to some of these smaller waterways, similar to the size in the UK. And then again, they're mostly so I guess to fall into a couple of distinct categories. You have sort of southern Sweden, they are small streams, like these ones in Skåne that I was talking about, Skåne County, and they're typically low gradient because there isn't much mountains there, and they meander quite nicely. The water's a bit more humic, so it's a bit peaty in colour. You don't get any of these super clear streams in the south, generally speaking. And then when you go into the mountains, you obviously have tree-lined freestone running. Not much there isn't masses of springs or spring creeks. So river productivity isn't great, and certainly as you go further north, the summers are shorter, so the rates of growth are quite limited. But what you gain is a lack of fishing pressure, like masses of water to share, and you have older fish, so the fish are probably larger overall. Although there is, still a fairly well-established catch and take culture here in Sweden. Quite often people go on their holidays, if they catch a fish, they'll take that fish, and they don't seem to be too. It's changing a bit more now, but they wouldn't seem too off-put by taking, say, like a 60-centimeter brown trout, which something would be an absolute specimen in the UK, and it's still not the most common sort of size of fish to catch up north, but you could expect one a trip kind of thing, not that rare. And these rivers are typically tree lined, and they're not untouched. The forestry industry here in Sweden straightened a lot of these rivers to float the trees down them to make it easier to transport them. So there have been lots of restoration efforts trying to most commonly just knock trees back in, put large rocks back in, just to try and give some sort of heterogeneity to the watercourse. Then lots of dams, lots of hydropower, things like that. And then when you get to the sort of mountains again, you get more into this sort of subalpine catchments, less trees and everything, and you get this sort of flat meadows, and you get these meandering dry fly streams again. And it's these, I think, the Swedish media or videos that come out of Sweden, people like Rolf Nylander and these videos that many listeners will be familiar with, tend to focus on because they're fantastic dry fly. You see the takes are very visual. I remember thinking, why don't they wait to make an easier cast to these fish? Like when you're watching these videos, and then you get there, and when you have these meadows, they usually sit between a couple of steep catchments, and there's a lot of water in them, and you don't appreciate the fact that it's straight down 2 meters. And so while this stream is only 2, 3, 4, 5 meters wide, there's no way you'd stand in it, and you're fishing from the bank, and it's quite technical like that. It's almost like the English upstream dry fly only, no wading style of fishing. And I'd say there's more of a dry fly culture here in Sweden than there is in the UK, mostly because probably you have better insect hatches still. And it's a very intense summer period when you're fishing up north. All that sort of hatch calendar gets squashed into a few more months to fish are far more opportunistic. It's the rivers are certainly different. Hasn't been too much of a learning curve, I'd say. The biggest learning curve has simply been not falling in beaver dams or beaver traps next to the rivers. There's so much of these tunnels that they make out of the rivers, and you're just walking along and you take one step and you go thigh deep down a hole. It's proper ankle breaking territory, and that was you're so used to in the UK, you'd move slowly watching the river and you barely take your eyes off it and you can do that completely fine. Whereas in Sweden, you really have to look where you're going because the bushes are so high, you can't see where your feet are going unless you really look. And I disappeared down many a hole before I learned that lesson.
And how do you compare the fishing culture there comparable to the UK?
So here, it's possibly also influenced by the way that I've developed my friendship circles and what I've exposed myself to, but there seems to be a lot less coarse fishing, bait fishing like there is in the UK to start with. There's an awful lot of lure fishing, and I would say of the general public, 80% of people are lure fishing, and there's a lot of places that you can do that, and 20% are fly fishing, and relative to the population, the numbers are massive. Like opening day of the sea trout season, you go to a populous, like a semi-well-known sea trout spot, and there will be like every 50 meters along the beach, there'll be an angler. And I've just never seen so many people fishing in one place before I'd come here. Like you leave the rivers around midsummer and it's still daylight, and we had a trip last year, and every night you're on the water till like the early hours in the morning, and you leave the water, and maybe the spinnacle will happen, maybe it didn't. And as you're driving back to your accommodation, there are still cars at every river access point of people that are fishing later than you and harder than you. And I just think back to the UK, some of the times on the Wye with a couple of friends that we would leave at midnight, there wouldn't be a soul fishing the river at that point in the UK. But here it's a very enthusiastic, committed crowd. They're really into it. They have, some interesting traditions that seem really hard to shift. Everyone still fishes dry fly on 9'5" weights. It's appropriate some of the time. They don't like longer rods. Longer rods would be fantastic here with the amount of foliage you're always casting over and have behind you. None of the 10-foot rod, someone would look at you like you're mad. But I mean, they work so well here.
And what is the age demographic? Do you think that may be, because what you said about people fishing much later, it makes me think generally it may well be younger people as a result of that. Is there a difference in the age demographic that you found since moving there?
I think like my little angling group that I've fallen into has the youngest is like 25 and the oldest is in his mid 50s. Actually, no, nearly 60. And it's quite a nice group, and we would fish typically the same hours together, but older members are very diehard anglers, and I don't think they're reflective of the general public. In general, though, fishing is all age groups, fly fishing and lure fishing, from little kids all the way through. It's just angling is like the second biggest sport or something in Sweden. I wish I'd maybe done some proper research ahead of this, and I could throw facts at you, but I take everything as not strictly cited. But the general gist of it is there. Like it is incredibly popular and incredibly diverse. And I think perhaps the reason why everyone's on a 9'5" weight still and all of this is the manufacturers here don't really like the Scandinavian, like your guidelines, your loop, your vision, maybe vision less so, but they don't seem to try and develop like 101 different niche products to fulfill a different niche to sell to the same angler. It doesn't really have that same. I feel like in the UK, fly fishing products, it's like another thing that you can sell to the same angler who's already fishing. Whereas here, it's like the companies are sort of arguing who can get the deal with the Halfords equivalent, whatever, big kind of like a decathlon or whatever, just to have their kit seen by the masses. And people make good stuff, but it's not that diverse. Unless you get into two-handed fishing, which I think is massively different to the UK in the sense of they do it in so many different shapes and sizes of all sorts. I don't even understand it that well, so I can't really talk about that. But it's mind-boggling. I looked to try and get into it, and it was just too much information. Really overwhelming. But then I guess rewinding a little though, talking about this fly industry, the way that sort of selling to people, there is the scope to have almost everyone here fishing because the population of Sweden is about the same as Greater London, and it's sharing a country that takes like 30 hours to drive across. Whereas in the UK, it's sort of the inverse. You have a much smaller region, and if you had similar levels of angling interest, everyone would be kind of treading on each other's toes, and then probably just wouldn't actually even, it would be tipping over the side where it's going to be having substantial impacts on nature throughout the UK. So yeah, it's a funny one, because when I started fishing, which was a bit of chance, I was in New Zealand with work, and then I got taken on a Tongariro for like some fly fishing. It was my first ever fly fishing experience, and spoiled. I was like, this is really cool. I enjoyed this, and I came back to the UK full of enthusiasm, having seen all these rivers. I'm outdoors a lot with my old job and riding bikes and running, what have you. Seeing all these rivers, and I was like, right, these are amazing fishing. These, that would be what a compliment to all the things I already do. And then you have that like realization of how to, like, to start with, I couldn't understand like who even owned what section, or that I knew I couldn't just go there with an EA rod license and fish, that there was something else. And then finding out who it was tricky. Then the costs were like really surprising. I wasn't sure if I wanted to commit to this. And I actually started fishing the urban rivers of Sheffield with a tenkara sort of style setup, because I wanted something that I was traveling a lot with work that I could take with me. I had no idea where to come from. And I was like, I've always enjoyed this idea of doing as much as possible with as little as possible. And also there was a very like, cornerstone of the tenkara community there in Sheffield with John Pearson and Paul Gaskell. And no doubt I was sort of eased down that route. And I fished like probably competition nymphing methods for the first couple of years of fishing almost exclusively, because on pressure waters, these were the most, you start out, you're always interested in just catching volumes of fish. And I think it's the same for a lot of people. Nobody starts and then decides they're just chasing big fish, that they have no fishing interest, or they're only going to fish a certain way. And yeah, chasing numbers. And this worked great. Like all over the world, I was catching lots of fish. I remember going to Colorado and fishing one of these extremely popular tailwaters, and you're in it for a tenkara rod and catching fish after fish, and being asked what flies I was fishing by like the local guy who's got 5 rods across the back of his car, and he's swapping between one rod to another. And I was like, oh no, it's literally like I was not catching anything myself until I worked out that the fish were all holding in these sort of like really like 2 feet long troughs. Like they weren't in any of the other normal areas you would find, and it was really like a case of letting the nymphs drop right down into the bottom of this trough. And as soon as you did, bang, like there was always a take. And once I cracked that code that day, it was an amazing day of fishing. It was really, and I was getting broken off a lot, I have to admit, like fishing a tenkara setup, these like large rainbows and browns and on 5x, just yeah, not really the kit for the job. And then I guess I picked up a proper fly rod. It was always, I think, the way I was going to go. It was interested me. I could see the limitations of the tenkara gear, especially where I was going, and I was going back to New Zealand again. I asked, I think it was John, and he was like, "Oh, I'll get this Richwood drift or whatever, 90 quid, 9'5" weight. It was on sale, and I bought that, and it lasted me so many years. And I then gave it to a friend when I moved away. I still miss that rod. It's a fantastic rod. And the more I've used more boutique gear and various other things, I've started to appreciate just how amazing value for money that kit was. But yeah, I got that rod, and then I also got a 3-weight for the more river fishing, and I had to learn how to cast, because I hadn't really been doing much of this conventional fly casting. And I think it was just purely time on the river and feeling things out that really got me there. You watch a few videos, you understand the mistakes you're making, and you sort of learn to correct. And I then started to build rods, and I made some glass rods, and then a lot of my fishing was with glass rods. And I've now noticed when you do some of this coastal sea trout fishing with fast rods, that I have this extremely slow, relaxed casting style that I've had to like relearn again. You're not casting 20 feet in a river with a slow rod. You're suddenly trying to shoot a whole head of line on 3 hauls, or like less even, into the wind, and it requires some slightly different strokes. But I can't remember where I've started from there. I've lost track of everything. Rambled on.
I think you've told us plenty, and it's been really, really interesting to hear that, and your path as a fly angler, and how you spoke about the formative years of your fishing. And it does strike me that you're probably missing it just a tiny bit.
Yeah, I mean, I really missed the 20 minutes to go fishing. There's no doubt about it. My last fishing right now was actually on a work trip that I had to do in Estonia to do some lab work. I have another institution that we work with, and they have some fancy extraction robots for DNA tissue and stuff. So I went there to use those. Timed perfectly with a Danica hatch. And if anyone's into small stream, like spooky water, small streams that are real short rods, or actually, I say real short rods. I settled on fishing a 10-foot 4-weight with a 5-weight line to make this work because they are super bushy, and I was like, they are so spooky that you want to be so far off the river. But brown trout and grayling, to like a good size, 3-4 pound fish, maybe slightly even larger, with amazing Danica hatches. A license in Estonia for 1 week is €3. So there you go. Some interesting off the grid fishing opportunities. Have you been yourself?
Not there, but that's obviously, you probably saw me raise my hand up when you said if anyone's interested, because that sounds to me dream fishing, and for some interesting size fish as well, and a mayfly hatch as well thrown into the bargain. So yes, I'd be all in on that and very, very interested. So, and it is amazing, isn't it? As somebody, as you have said, who likes not to fish in the same place all of the time, these things must be fascinating for you to go visit and go try out. And for you then, does that mean that box is ticked, or was it enough for you want to go back to give it a go again?
I'd like to go to some of the more northern reaches of the country to see some of the slightly larger streams that have some of these sea trout, because you get the anadromous fresh sea trout taking the mayflies in these streams that are located in the sea, and then you get some really big trout as well. It was quite a great experience, and it's public water basically for the most part. So this license, you just choose a point on the map and you go there. It's similar to Sweden. There's Allemansrätt, which is everyone can go wherever you want as long as you're pretty much not in someone's back garden. And you can't overnight on private property, but you can be on private property during the day. And it's really set up for just fishing wherever you want in that exploratory style. And yeah, I mean, it was fantastic. I would be tempted to kind of go back. It was a bit hard juggling work. I never fished a single spinnerful because I was there to do like very long days in a lab. I was there for increased throughput in my work, so I couldn't just fish myself silly. So maybe I'd go back for that reason. But then, I guess relating this back to Sheffield, I would fish every other day. This was start of June, so a month ago, and then the time I fished before that was 1 month prior, and I was back in the UK, and I was up fishing sort of near Aberdeen way on some of those lovely fishes, early season dry fly fishing with a great crowd of people like Liam, Stephen, Sandy was about, and Gareth Pedley from the Wild Trout Trust. And just an incredibly awesome week of fishing. Tough. It wasn't easy. The March Browns were on for like maybe 30-40 minutes a day. It was windy all the time, and I at one point just believed I was incapable of seeing a rise, and I wondered how I'd ever seen a rise at any point in my life up until that, because I was having these horrendous days of like really hard fishing, staring like bright sunlight, windy waters, and I'm like, there's nothing happening here. And I message in the WhatsApp group, and Gareth's just like, oh yeah, I just had this 4-pounder. I'm like, what? It's not fair. You're also saying that I've got migraines from staring at the water so much, so perhaps he had a higher level of concentration than I did. And again, that water was 5 hours drive from where I was in Sheffield, maybe 6. But now I live in Sweden. A 6-hour drive to go fly fishing is a very normal prospect. And back in the UK, I had sort of got myself in this bit of a rut of like, I ended up fishing the same. I go back to this earlier comment of like fishing the same day multiple times over and over. Identical everything, identical water or whatever. When I was sort of more constricted to the same water, I just chose to experiment a lot more. And it could be dry fly fishing still. But it would be like really trying to like break my understandings of what works in a dry fly fishing perspective, or how you can attract fish with dry flies, not in a conventional sort of just straight upstream manner, or People are fishing mayfly hatch, and I'm only going to fish large caddis patterns. Works completely fine, and all these sorts of things. And just so I would always want to learn and do something differently like that. I was doing that because I believed that this water was the exploratory side was out of reach, and a 6-hour drive in the UK to go fly fishing seems like a completely outrageous prospect. But there is so much in Scotland, and certainly the stuff in the borders is only like 4 hours away. And I think back now, why didn't I go more often? Why did I fish all the time in the sort of similar region around where I lived? Yeah. So I sort of regret that. I'd never really ticked the Scotland box. I tried to do a big summer trip just before I was moving to Sweden. And I went one trip. I stopped on the Eden on the way up, saw some fantastic fish, really low water, really tricky fishing, spooked a lot of fish, had a couple of nights was tricky, and then continued on up to meet Gareth on one of his favourite rivers. And he's a absolute dry or die nut for the UK, and we didn't make a cast for a whole day. It wasn't the weather. It gone cold. It was over, like really cold. There was no like batis or anything like that. Surprisingly, large darks coming off. I guess we were still kind of middle of summer. If it was colder and it was early or late season, we may have seen them. We just had a great chat. Sat by a river, watched a lot of different pools. Learned a lot. I've learned a lot from him. I just like approach for dry fly fishing, especially big fish, and how wary big fish can be, and just some of the precautions to sort of take with that, and where to see them and how to expect them under different circumstances. And then, so that was day 2 of the trip. Now, day 3, I just had a lock that I had in mind. I had some lovely information from good friends people were a little more willing to divulge their spots when you're moving out of the country. They figure you won't be there to trouble them. And I went to hunt down some char and brook trout that had been long ago stocked in a high sort of alpine locks, and managed to find brook trout, which I was really pleased with. That was one of the goals of the trip. Also managed to drown my phone in the lake. It slipped off the bank while I was setting up a remote camera shot using my phone as the remote. Slid all the way down into the water, sort of drowned itself. And I remember like thinking and weighing up my options. It's like, I told my girlfriend I'm camping in the hills for a few days. If I don't check in, she might get worried. Like, okay, how do we avoid a mountain rescue call out? And then I was like, okay, we can probably like mitigate that. But then all the other logistics of the trip, finding information about fishing in the UK, like I've written it all down. It was all there. It was all stored, but digitally on my phone. All the campsites, all the sort of itinerary planning I'd done for this massive Scotland sort of departing trip. And I realized all that was gone. And I somewhat sulked and just sort of drove all the way back to Sheffield, like 9.5 hours. Probably should have bought a new phone, tried to use the SIM card, like get things running that way. Maybe that would have been better. I just threw the toys out the pram. I was like, this trip is done. What a shame. Like I planned these 2 weeks of fishing and it didn't happen. Ended up coming back to Sheffield, still having a nice time fishing the local area, but similar waters, just trying different things and what have you.
It's funny, isn't it, that we can be, and you said early on, we can be not stuck, but used to fishing a place. And I'm guilty of that I fish one place in particular, although I've tried to travel a little bit further and I've joined a funky chalk stream club that I'm really, really enjoying. Was obsessed by a sizable grayling that I saw the other day that was too clever for me. And it is good, isn't it, to step outside sometimes. Otherwise you can sort of sometimes do what you normally do. Now, the way that I fish my stream, I'll wait for a rising fish, as you said, with Gareth. So it's always interesting. And yesterday was a classic case, nothing going on during the day. So I thought, right, I'll come back in the evening. And again, I waited for ages and ages and ages, had 2 rises, was very lucky, caught the 2 fish and went home, and I was perfectly happy. So that sort of keeps me from doing the same thing the whole time. But it can be, trips like you described can be a really nice way to inject a different angle into your fishing, can't it?
It can be, absolutely. And here, the trip planning usually is an entire winter of looking at maps, because you can usually get fishing where you see on a map and aerial images, looking at river systems. just endless looking and looking and looking. And I remember after my first winter here, so I arrived in February, it's still pretty much middle of the winter here. And I made a hit list of where I wanted to go that summer. I had a social trip with this sea trout group to Dalarna, which is sort of some of the nearest trout fishing that we have here to Stockholm, but mountain fishing, and had a wonderful time. The first fish I hooked on that trip on a dry fly, I was not prepared for. It was probably like a 5 pound brown trout that absolutely tore off upstream, and I'm just in that like first fish of the year, fumbling line, don't know what I'm doing, just was gone. That was that. And a friend got a great video of this thing just absolutely tearing off. Ran so far, I'd not had a trout do that. I don't know if it was because I was so out of control of the situation that it did that, or whether it was just a really spunky fish that decided it was going to run off in that fashion. So I had that trip, and then I had the opportunity to do a solo trip. And while I kind of longed for some company, definitely after some of the experiences that I had on that trip, it is nice to be on your completely own agenda. And I arrived in a region of Sweden to like 9 degrees. It's summertime. It shouldn't be 9 degrees. It's raining. It's wet. And the first river I visited was one where the access was fairly reasonable. Couldn't find much information about it online, but also didn't want to look too deep online for information because that would spoil some of the. Well, it would set expectations, and it would spoil some of the joy of like what you could discover. And I remember that first day, I'm like, will there be anything rising? I have no idea. Is there going to be anything hatching? And as I was watching the river, like a Beatis for Danai just kind of came and landed on the rod. I was like, oh, this is a great sign. Like, I want a few more of these, maybe I would see something. And I saw one fish rise, and this was an afternoon that had just arrived. It rose very far out this is a big river, very far out in the big river. You do that classic, like, wade as stupidly deep as you can go. You're trying to cast to it. You know that even if you can get your fly near it, making a cast where you've got the whole head of the line, probably the same length of the line out again, and then the leader, the amount of current that's between you and that fish, it's never going to get a drift. Like, even if you got that in there, all the while, like, you're stood this deep, so the back cast is landing on the water on that like last hole because you're just not punching the cast right, and you're getting increasingly frustrated. And I was like quite dejected when I left the river. Came back the next day, and I was like, well, look upstream. I've seen these other bits on the map. And I remember seeing this nose of a fish coming out of a sink. And I was like, okay, this could be the only fish I see all day. So let's approach this properly. I made quite a deep way to get to the right place to target the fish from, crossing through. It was where the stream had come into this wonderful braided series of channels. And I was on one of these channels. So it was a little more like you could move around a bit. And lovely fish. It was, I remember catching that and being like, oh, the whole trip's okay. Like, this was a fish of maybe 3 pounds. So it was a lovely dry fly fish. And by UK standards, I've been ecstatic. And okay, now I'll move up to the next pool. And as I got to this next pool, there were 3 fish in it rising. I was amazed to see so much going on. And I couldn't work out if it was 3 or if it was 1 that seemed fairly, like, it was on the outside of a bend that was in good flow. So I was very happy it was stationary. And then there was another one that was maybe moving around a bit. And the one that was moving around a bit, I was like, okay, like, let's see how close I can get to this, because I want to work out if it is different fish or if I can see it, because this water was absolutely gin clear. Like, the visibility was 6 meters to the bottom. Like, wow. There was a bridge lower downstream that you could stand on and look off, and it's this is a big river, and it gets tunneled under this bridge and it scours down, and you could see, like, well, it's probably 10 meters down, just every detail on the bottom of the water, just distorted by like the gradual currents of the river above. And as I approached this bend pool, and I was getting close to this fish that I thought was moving around, and I was like thinking that I'm taking all the care in the world, because these are like quite nice fish that I can tell from the rises. And as I try to get close to this patrolling fish, still with a bit of the excitement of the one I just caught, I didn't wait enough, and I pretty much stood on a fantastic trout that did that classic bow wave up the right hand side of the pool. I was like, oh god. So I sat for maybe 40 minutes, and in this time, I hadn't been that interested in the fish in the current. It hadn't been like it'd been very subtle takes, like taking emerges. And it started to take a few duns. And I had never, like, you see, like in Scotland, when you get a rise, you see the nose of a fish sometimes coming out of the water. And that's like the best looking rise in the world when you can actually see physical fish head coming out. But what I saw in this instance is I can only liken to both sides of my hands come out of the water and take a dun. And you're like, did I see that? Was that a wave? Like, you're doubting everything. And you're like, oh God, it is. It's an absolutely humongous fish. And this is day 2 of this trip of a river that I've just looked at on satellite maps because it looked really nice, had some interesting features. It was well connected to lakes. There was a good potential for big fish. There's good connectivity with like nice spawning grounds as well as good lakes and everything that in my mind says it should be a good big fish water. And again, I was like, oh, well, I either try and make the cast from the inside of the bend. It's a bit of a back eddy coming into the bend. I don't really fancy my chances too much. Or I get so close to this fish on the bank, and this bank had collapsed on the outside of the bend. It's one of these like softer, siltier banks, and it's all falling away. I was like, I don't really want to be on that bank. It could completely give way. I was like, that's the only place to go. And so I crossed again. I got so close to it, and I could see this fish now, like just rising. And it was classic, you're casting with half a rod length of fly line, rest of its leader, like a little size 16 fly. And it was moving enough that like you made one cast and I thought, like, oh God, that was wrong place. And, you just have that horrible recoil and you're studying because I can see the fish now and you're watching it and you're like, oh, still feeding. And about 2 casts later, managed to hook into it. And then like these are the wonderful thing about some of the more remote rivers is they are untouched. They are managed. What this means is though, there are like trees in the river. There are all sorts of nature that would normally be maybe pruned or removed for flood risk reasons. I don't know, like things that happen in the UK. And in this pool, there were like 2 seriously big trees that were right on the bottom, and this fish is going all over the place. And I just heart in mouth moment, and I couldn't move. Where I was on the bank to actually cast to it meant I didn't have the luxury of moving much to try and fight the fish. So I felt like I was really at the mercy of some serious like luck. And I got lucky, and the fish that I caught was 4 kilos, so it was 8.4 on the dry fly, and biggest brown trout I've ever caught on a dry fly. Of a river that I had no expectations of, and I did nothing to believe. I hadn't seen any other anglers there. It was very like lightly trodden around the banks. It could have just been like the local people going for walks with their dogs, and I couldn't believe it. And I was like, well, what do I do with the rest of my summer now? This has well exceeded my expectations of what I wanted to do. And you have this like dejection. I was like, right, well then the rest of this trip I'll go to the really remote places because that makes sense, and that's what I'll do. And the weather actually got warmer, and the fishing didn't improve with the warmer weather. It was like typical like summer. Maybe it was really late evenings, and I did some of these really big hike outs to this. There was this one limestone river. Being limestone, you immediately get excited that it's got to be really productive. Big water, and I sat on this pool that you would wager there was a good fish in there, like a serious fish. And I just saw nothing. And the access was like 5.5 hours of hiking across like bogs to get to this point. And I didn't really make a cast. Like that was a total flop of a day. And then I went back to this same river that I started on, where I caught this sort of big fish. And in the nice weather, there were anglers everywhere. It was clearly like, obviously it has big fish in it, and it was clearly well known, but no one else wanted to be there in 8 or 9 degrees drizzly days when actually it was fishing fantastically. And everyone was there in the summer. And I just hadn't even conceived that like when I'd go back that it would just be like you looked off the bridge and you just saw angler all the way along this run that came into this bridge and the same downstream. And there was still some big fish about, and there were still some trickier to access pools that had nice fish in, which is something that I feel shares a nice similarity to the rivers back in Sheffield. You found the best fish in the hardest access places, because in anywhere that's pressured, like big fish don't like being bothered on a daily basis, and they will probably move on. And oh yeah, it was just an incredible experience. And it's certainly, when there is fish like that on the cards, you don't mind not fishing for months on end and then having an intense week or two for something that's really like memorable, and you'll really remember that fish, and a memory that will stay with you.
Absolutely. What a wonderful story. What a wonderful fish. And I think I'd probably snip off and say, yeah, that's enough, because it's always that difficult one that you think, well, I've caught this phenomenal trout. What do I do now?
Yeah.
And you go through that difficult process, or at least I do. And very often I'll snip off if I've had a nice fish and say that does it the honor it deserves. And also the next fish I catch the next day works the same way. So that's how I like to think about it. But I wanted to move on a little bit and talk about your obviously accomplished photographer from your previous line of work. And I was thrilled when you shot the cover for Fly Culture. For listeners who read Fly Culture, it's the one with the frozen wading boots, which I know I'd talked to you about for a little while and absolutely loved the image when it came out. I was also thrilled to be in the company of US Mag's Fly Fish Journal and the Drake, which I admire greatly, and you shot for them as well. And you've also written a piece for us about building a rod, and you touched on glass earlier, and it was a glass rod, and you built it during lockdown. Was that a fun process for you? And also, what was it like when you caught that first trout on that rod that you built yourself?
Well, yeah. So, I guess to touch on the first bit, photography, was my previous job, and that was all outdoor sports and mountain biking and things like this, and that takes you to places with fantastic rivers and afforded me many wonderful fishing destinations. And when when I was back from these trips and with this work, it was typically winter time, and I had become so obsessed with fishing by this point that I could, like, winter fishing in the UK. Okay, there's grayling fishing, but it's sort of dredging heavy check nymphs. I'd done a bit for fly fishing for pike. That was kind of nice, but it's not the sort of stuff that made me want to get out every day and go do it. And that's kind of where the rod building started. I quite like making things, and sort of the first rod I took a punt on was one of the Taniwa Rodworks like discount sale. It was an E-glass 1/2 weight, so super small stream job, and it was like £18 from the blank. And I spoke to Mark at Taniwa, and he was like, "What else do I need?" I have no idea really, and he was very useful in advising me and sending me the blank and a few other bits. And I built this rod primarily to fish the river the tiny stream that was on my doorstep in Sheffield, and it would be like quite appropriate for that. And as soon as I cast that rod, it was like I couldn't believe how much. I think the build all in cost me 45 quid, and it was a very enjoyable experience. I'd made a lot of tools to assist with the building myself, like rod turners for a microwave motor and these sorts of things, and everything was done. It didn't have to be done on a budget, but I just enjoyed that process of like trying to have as much input through as many steps of it as possible. And yeah, I fished that rod really happily, and I was like, well, at this point, my river rod, there's nothing wrong with it. It was, and again, it was still one of those Witchwood drifts. It was the 9'6" 3-weight, great rod again. And I was like, well, let's lockdown happened. Sorry. And then I was like, well, now I really have nothing to do. There's no work going on. I can't go fishing. And building another rod seemed like a really good thing to do. And I was like, I'll get more generic river rod. So I then got I built a 7.5 foot 4-weight, and postage was slow, as you can remember from those times, and it felt like an eternity waiting for all the bits. And I built that one in the house, and I documented some of the process because, again, I didn't have much to do. It was in lockdown, and Yeah, it was interesting. As the rod got finished, the rules started to ease, and there was still this like total. I won't say grey area. It felt like it was fairly enforced. That you couldn't go far when we could go out again, or at least to fish. So that meant I would be fishing on my local streams in Sheffield, and all of lockdown, I've been walking rivers and spotting fish, and they've been quite good fly life. And they're in the surface and just spotting them and spotting them and spotting them and spotting them. And I think that contributed a lot to my real turning point of fishing almost only dry fly fishing, with a caveat of sometimes throwing very dirty streamers when there's absolutely no fly life, and not less so in Sweden. Barely use them in Sweden, but in the urban rivers in Sheffield, you're not graced with fly life. It's not something that goes hand in hand, but they can be surprising with what they would yield, especially. It sounds bad saying this in a semi-positive context, but like when you have fish kills and things like this, the surviving fish quite often then get like if the invertebrate life recovers, you then have less competition and you have increased growth rates, and you can end up with like these quite destabilized populations, but some surprisingly large fish. And for them, the streamer fishing was great fun. But yeah, after all this walking the streams, watching the trout, albeit very small, I was like, right, fish dry fly, basically. I don't know really what was the deal, because it didn't seem like we had any fly life after the lockdown finished for a long time. It was incredibly slow. And I think my first dry fly fish with that rod was extra memorable, because I was walking to the pub to see some friends, and I just had it in my backpack, 4-piece, 7.5 foot rod. You didn't even need to have it poking out of the bag. It was wonderfully compact. And along the stream that I've walked every day almost in lockdown, it goes through. Theo's written about it. It's probably not too hard for people to work out if they know these sorts of things, especially if there's a pub nearby. And I saw a fish rising, so I just tied on like a CDC emerger, um, and made a couple of casts to that fish, and yeah, it took the fly, and it was just a little like, yeah, this big, small brown trout. That was it. I felt very content, very happy. That was the first fish with that rod, caught in on the dry fly, and then I just continued on my way to the pub, just with a good grin on my face to meet some friends for some food. And so yeah, and that was very local as it get. And then I managed to expand a bit further as the restrictions eased. I fished more into the Peak District. I'd also made some new relationships through social media, which felt like the only way to find other young anglers in the UK. And I gained access to try some other water as a guest of friends and things like this. And I started to fish some more of the really like quite nice limestone rivers in the Peak District. And yeah, from there onwards, I sort of fished mostly dry flies and on whatever river I was on short glass rods. And then when I came to move to Sweden, I was like, right, well, to start with, I started that whole research of what's the trout fishing near Stockholm. Looking at a map, it's so much further north than we are. How can it not have trout? And then you discover that there aren't trout, and you're like, is this true? And I start like downloading data sets, mapping them, and I'm being like, oh, it's true. All their electrofishing doesn't really show trout like anywhere near like Stockholm. And as one other side, that's also been one good way of finding fish in new places. If you can understand government monitoring programs, it's very useful for discovering where fish are. And I was like, okay, so it's sea trout fishing. All right. Well, I don't currently own a rod heavier than a 5 weight, and my 5 weight is quite a medium, slow action, slow by modern standards 5 weight. We've got to build a new rod. So I got in contact with a Swedish store to buy a blank from them to build into a sea trout rod. And so I went with a really fast, like red truck 6 weight. And it was that conversation that I maintained with the store before coming out here that then got me invited on a sea trout trip only within a week of I arrived in the country in February, and we went on a South Coast sea trout trip like 1 week later, still in February. And I got to meet this really great group of people who I've been fishing with a lot since. And awesome. I learned a lot about Swedish culture. I learned a lot about Swedish fishing, like their expectations. They're always like, when you're on the South Coast, they want to wait for the West Coast sea trout fishing season to start. And as soon as you're on the West Coast to go sea trout fishing, they're all getting excited about mountain fishing started. And it's this continuous cycle of like always looking for the next, because you could you can fish year round in a way for trout with the coastal sea trout fishing. And yeah, throwing out something and retrieving it is not my ideal type of fishing. But there's something about the attrition of the cold and the adversity, and when you finally get something, it does feel really special. And I think that's why you persist with it. And so yeah, I built that 6 weight, and I have to admit, I've not built. No, I have built a rod since. I built a backup 5 weight. I hadn't really broken a rod till I moved to Sweden, and I don't know what's changed, but I've broken a few tips since I've been here. So actually, the justification for being on these remote rivers, and I broke the tip of my 5 weight carbon rod, and then I ended up with that 4 weight that I'd made, fishing these large rivers for these large fish, and it was a little limiting, especially in the wind. I was like, oh, I need a backup 5 weight, and I built that 5 weight without even a rod turner. I was stuck in this purgatory of just moved to Sweden. I don't have my migration sorted. I'm waiting for my residence permit, which took 10 months. I can't work here. I can't leave because my EU visa has expired. And if I leave, it's 180 days to come back here. We sold the house in Sheffield. My girlfriend's here in Sweden. So I wasn't working, but at the same time, well, I wasn't working in Sweden and I couldn't work with my photography outside of Sweden. So I had all this free time, but then I had no income. And I'm in Scandinavia, which is not the cheapest place to be with no income. So I got this cheap 5 weight blank. I did not want to buy a rod turner or anything like that. And I set timers going from turning every 1 minute a quarter turn all the way through to every hour a quarter turn in stages on my phone. And I would just manually turn the epoxy setting on these 4 sections of this rod. And it worked. It was a real budget build again, but it was just a real utility rod, that one, for the sake of having some purpose. So I would love to build more rods, but I am quite conflicted with owning more gear than I need. I always try to refine it down and cut it back. I never take much. I don't fish many different patterns. It really is sort of like having, for me, just some rods spaced apart that are suited to throwing different types of lines, different sizes of flies for really different purposes of fishing. And then, yeah, trying to simplify the rest of it as much as possible, but not just for simple sake, to make it as applicable as possible still. But then just so you can focus purely on the fishing and where you're going. And I'm looking at the map all the time. I'm not worrying about what patterns I'm going to take or what fly level. I'm fairly happy that what I have works in 99% of scenarios. So yeah, it's not too much of an issue.
I like your style. We're coming up an hour now, but I wanted to talk with you about your work and just to sort of touch on that, really, that involves researching trout disease. Has it given you an even greater love for trout and a greater respect for them too?
Yes, I believe so. I'm now a parasitologist. It's been quite the switch of careers somehow in the space of 2 years, deciding in the lockdowns that I wasn't going to continue with photography as great and as successful as it was going. I didn't want to continue. I struggled to reason to myself anymore why I was going to multiple different countries for the sake of, say, photographing a pair of shoes for a commercial photography job. All this palaver and everything involved, all the travel, and it would be nearly 50 flights a year, probably more. And yeah, just to do these not small, you're photographing a pair of shoes, it's great. What am I doing? I'm probably encouraging people to get out and be active, maybe, if they want to buy that shoes, and that incentivizes them to do something. But I struggled to see sort of the value in that. And I was like, well, I could make my photography more UK based, but then at the same time, up until photography as a career, which I kind of fell into, it was never a plan, I'd been quite science based. So let's take this science forwards and try and do that again. And I kind of wanted to go into weather and that side of things. I'd done maths as an undergrad and I thought this would be suitable. It was both very expensive to do a master's degree in anything like meteorology related, weather related, and nothing was on offer near where I lived in Sheffield, and I didn't want to move for the sake of the studies. And I ended up then doing a degree in geographic information systems, which I've been using a bit of with some of the Wild Trout Trust stuff I'd looked at. I've been volunteering with, and with that I focused it more towards like environmental analysis and looking a lot at rivers. I did my master's thesis all around monitoring river restoration with drones and like how the habitats actually changed before and after river restoration efforts. And then when I came to Sweden, the plan was to get a GIS job. It wasn't really to go working in trout or anything like that. But I quickly learned that while everyone here speaks English, a GIS job would be interfacing with Swedish data sets or Swedish stakeholders or Swedish landowners, and they all required Swedish as a language. And I was sort of back to the drawing board a bit. This plan started to fall apart. And I pretty much just put trout into the into the job search. Like, what a sort of, it seems a silly thing to do, but this PhD popped up and it had 1 week left on the application deadline. And PhDs here in Sweden are very much like a job. You're salaried, you're paying taxes, you get parental leave if you want that, you get, a pension with your PhD. And for the university that I'd be working for, I'd be employed by the government. So you also get all the government employee perks. I was like, okay, so this could be good. But this was a biology PhD. And I am not a biologist by any stretch of the imagination. So I emailed the guy running it. And I said, this is my background. This is what I've done. There's maths. There's like years of being an absolute trout nerd, speaking with people that are like professors in this side of things, like Johnny Gray, Paul Gaskell, who are very science-minded and all this. Then I have this JS background. I'm like, yeah, but put an application in. It's worth your time. And fast forward, I ended up getting that PhD. And the PhD is focused on this temperature-dependent parasite that is pretty much everywhere, but has had a very positive, neutral relationship with trout. All salmonids are hosts for this. We're focusing a lot on trout because they're one of the ones that complete the circle. They actually urinate the parasite on and they spread it further. And when things get warm, the trout has a strange, I guess the easiest way to describe it, like immune response to the parasite, and it's no longer an amicable host-parasite relationship. And the kidney starts to swell, and you get all these issues in the kidneys, and these fish become anemic. So the fish that are infected with the parasite, they then go on to have something called proliferative kidney disease, which is when they've got this proliferated kidney. And the easiest way to sort of summarize its effects would be like if a fish dies in hot water scenarios at 25 degrees, like a trout, it's absolute upper thermal limit. If they had this disease, they're dying at 22 or 21 degrees. It's lowering this threshold. And there's been research about this disease in Austria and Germany and Switzerland, and they've started to attribute it to one of their main causes for trout decline with sort of warming climate. They couldn't figure it out, but this disease that had been seen in aquaculture actually exists in the wild, and there's all these other mechanics of it to understand, and we had no idea where it was in Sweden. So my job now is to work out where this is in Sweden, work out how it interacts with the environment and what we can do maybe going forwards to sort of try and moderate the effects of humans on the parasite and the environment on the parasite, because there's no way you're getting rid of the parasite, and it's not necessarily been a bad thing. It just is now that everything's getting warmer. And to do that, I have to look at trout every day. I started with 3.5 months straight of dissecting juvenile trout, and and I had to remove the kidneys, and then I've been using molecular methods to screen these kidneys for the parasite to understand from all across Sweden, 150 locations where this parasite is. And it gives a definite new, you're even more focused on the challenges that it has as a species to thrive and maintain positive populations. I'm reading all the reports on population status. I have raw data to look at, and it has given me more respect for the fish and furthered my interest only really in targeting a select few fish, practicing good catch and release, and not really bothering all the trout in a river, which is what I used to do. and people can fish however they want, as long as they're not decimating populations of fish. If they want to take one or two in an area that can handle it, then that's fine with me. I don't want to sort of tell them otherwise, even if I feel different. But yeah, lots more newfound respect for fish, and it's not put me off fishing. There's a couple of colleagues I have that they started these jobs and then they stopped fishing. They maybe just lost some of the enthusiasm around it. I'd say it's still there, but it's in this more intense go away for a week. That's fishing. And outside of that, trout is work, and it's interesting work. Working with this parasite, we had drought conditions before this rain arrived, and we're sort of seeing the effects on the west coast already. I believe it has a lot of effects in the UK. What we are seeing here from my preliminary data is it's small coastal streams, typically sea trout populations, that are possibly being impacted the most by this parasite. And they've studied it in the test and things like that. It is throughout the UK. It's just not something that most people think about. And what we have here in Sweden, which my work's about to move on to, is we have so many years of electrofishing data. Is once we know where this parasite has been, is trying to see if we can determine, has there been a population effect, like in our monitoring, has there been substantial population losses due to this parasite or something, so that we can say, is it something we should be worried about or not?
That's fascinating. And also, given the climate that we are living in, it's going to become more and more pertinent. So thank you for looking into that. As I said, we've talked over an hour. I should also say that Duncan's photography has appeared, if you've got the current edition of Fly Culture as well. There's a couple of his beautiful images at the very front. The interesting one with the waders in the mirror. And also, I think I just called it waders. And then there's one called Long Cast as well, which Duncan's work as well. So we're incredibly lucky to have you in fly fishing for a number of reasons, for your photography skills, your writing skills, and that you're looking out for trout right now. So I'd like to thank you for that. I'd like to thank you for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast. If people want to connect with you, how do they find you? What are your social media handles?
I guess the only one I really use is there's this one called P, then the number 4, and then Dunk, D-U-N-C. It's a bit of an abstract name, and it was a bit of an in-joke years ago when it was made. But that's sort of become my only social media. I have a photography account, Duncan Philpott. Has a lot of followers, not used it in 3 years or something like that. Maintaining social media was not one of the things I enjoyed about the previous job. And as soon as I didn't have to do that, I stopped doing that. Certainly some of my fishing musings and outdoor stuff and conversations happen on that Instagram account, the P4Dunk. Many conversations which have made me have more appreciation for some of the people in the fly fishing industry, certainly in the UK, connected me with some really awesome people before I left.
Fantastic. Duncan, it's been brilliant to catch up as always. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Pete.
Well, everyone, that's another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one. We covered a lot of ground. And as ever, there's going to be plenty more editions of the Fly Culture podcast coming very, very soon. Thanks for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.